Over the next few months, you're going to hear people describe the time and the period they went through as a country as the second nadir, and you know what it means, but let me tell you kind of like the historical background and relevance of it and why people are using that to describe the time period that we're in as a country now. The first nadir came after Reconstruction, and it essentially dealt with the 14th, 13th, and 15th Amendment and the passage of the first iterative Civil Rights Acts, which gave Black people full citizenship in the country, and the election of a few Black people to the United States Congress and other statewide positions across the southern United States. And the backlash of it resulted in the first nadir, or Jim Crow America, which nadir basically just means the lowest point, the point where, things are presumably the worst that they'll ever be, right? And that point for Black Americans, after all those years of slavery came, Jim Crow instituted after it had just been promised and partially granted true freedom for the first time in the United States. The first nadir really was a three-part of the nadir. Let me see how to say it again. Hold on, because I think I'm saying it wrong. I think it's nadir. Let's see what Merriam-Webster says.
Nadir.
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 Nadir. Nadir or nadir. Nadir. So the first nadir came really with the help of all three branches of government. You had the radical Republicans in office with the people who ended slavery, who were trying to kind of institute laws across the land that would protect Black people, particularly those in the southern United States, and ensure equal and fair access to government. But you also had Andrew Johnson as president, and you had Southerners who were disgruntled about the idea of Black people having full and equal citizenship or equal rights as white people, and also representing them in Congress when the people who had represented white folks in the Confederate Army were essentially banned from holding elected office, were really disgruntled and upset about that. So then we have basically 70 years, really like all the years up until the VRA and the civil rights bills of the 1960s and 50s, before anything is done to essentially grant Black folks true citizenship. And so the executive branch's part was the rescission of the troops from the Southern United States, which ensured Black people protections from intimidation, discrimination, segregation in the Southern United States at that time period. And then you also have the legislative's part with them overturning the decision to disallow those people who betrayed their country back in the government. They allowed them to come back to Congress. And then the Supreme Court's portion was them issuing decisions like Plessy versus Ferguson, which made segregation legal. The separate but equal doctrine came from Plessy versus Ferguson, which we knew was separate and unequal, which was the law of the land until 1954 with Brown v. Board. And so why is that important, and why people are using that term to describe where we are now? Even back in like the late 2017, 18 era, Black people in state legislative houses were sounding the alarm and saying, say no to Jim Crow 2.0. Because essentially the blueprint and the plan for Project 2025 was already happening in state houses across the South. And they kind of saw the writing on the wall and were like, yeah, this looks like what Texas used to like, what Florida used to look like. Like, we've seen this playbook before. And it's the coordinated effort between all three branches of government, where the federal government, the legislature, right, when the Republicans get the power to essentially say that we're not going to write any more laws that create civil rights guarantees and liberties for people who are minoritized in America. And then you have the executive branch who is suing on behalf of the federal government to prevent any enforcement of those laws, or just not enforcing those laws by choice. Then you have the Supreme Court, who's essentially invalidating these laws and saying that they're illegal and or no longer necessary because of their effectiveness, right? Like, that's one of the things that RBG points out in her dissent in Shelby County, is that the Supreme Court essentially rationalizes the non-need for the VRA Section 5 pre-clearance requirement comes from the fact that it has been so successful. That's illogical. That's illogical. Because something works, we no longer need it. Like, but that's how the governments work. They worked lock and step in the first Nadir to really disenfranchise and disempower Black folks, and it's seemingly what's happening now. And we've seen major gains as a consequence of the VRA in this country and the other civil rights bills in general. But the VRA, we've seen a woman come to the helm at the Speaker of the House position, Nancy Pelosi. We've seen a Black man be elected president, and we've seen Black men and women in the helm of the Office of the Attorney General. Sonia Sotomayor became the first woman of Latino descent on the Supreme Court. Ketanji Brown Jackson is the first Black woman on the Supreme Court. And we've also seen kind of this coordinated effort over the last 2 decades of this court and the conservative members of the Congress and state legislatures across the country kind of work together for this moment that arrived in 2025 with Project 2025, and also the re-election of President Trump to the White House, which kind of just set the tone for us. So I want to break down how I look at kind of everything that happened and how I think they set up the second Nadir and like why we are here now. I feel like there were like a warning shot and 2 tests. And the first warning shot, I feel like for our generation, for my generation, I was 14 when Shelby County versus Holder came down, but I remember like the impact and reading about it. And I even wrote papers about it in law school about like how it drastically changed. It literally affected the way that I had access to the polls in college because the pre-clearance provisions were no longer the law of the land. So where I went to school, Waller County was able to redraw or move our voting location from an on-campus voting location to an off-campus community center, even though my campus had the largest voting block in the county, right? And most people that voted, most registered voters in that county and that precinct lived on campus, and so there was no longer an on-campus early voting site at our institution. It was moved to the community center, which was in theory close, but it was also a hindrance because it was kind of out of the way, and it was an extra distance from campus that was like a far walk from where's the Memorial Student Center, which is something we all use and access every day. So Shelby County came down in 2013, and essentially what that decision did was say that Section 5's pre-clearance requirement, which required the southern states who had a history of discriminating against Black people previously to go before court, or I believe the Attorney General's office, the United States Attorney General's office, and justify their need for an election change. And if that change didn't meet certain requirements, or if the Department of Justice or the court determined that it would discriminate against Black people or people of color in the Southern United States, that change would be rejected. And essentially, voting rights lawyers on our opponent's sides have been fighting the VRA since inception. And when they got a chance to get it before the Supreme Court, they got Section 5 gutted. And Section 5 is no longer a provision that is enforceable and it hasn't been enforceable for over a decade now, for issues related to discriminating and pre-clearance and like those voter protections in general. But what was preserved was Section 2, which was the racial discrimination piece, which allowed for challenges to things like what we just saw come down from Louisiana versus Cali, where there was opportunity districts for Black people to elect candidates of their choice to represent them in Congress. As long as you could prove a certain set of requirements, you could show that a legislature or someone discriminated against Black people and drew them out of a map intentionally in a way that is in violation of the law. So, but going back to the first warning shot for my generation, like I said, came with Shelby County. And then shortly thereafter, we have the 2016 presidential election, which I feel like was our first kind of test, and it was Hillary versus Trump. And I feel like in that election, President Trump really set it up to be like the enemy. He set up his opponent to be the enemy, not only Hillary Clinton, but the enemy with like at our border. And he used that hate. And I think a lot about that quote that Ta-Nehisi Coates said in the interview with Ezra Klein that people cling to hope being such a powerful and moving force with Barack Obama, and how it was so inspiring that people were so hopeful about the prospect of the election of a first Black president and what that meant for the country. But people also, there were a lot of people who were also very angry and upset in the same way that people were in the late 1800s when they saw Black men represented in Congress then about Barack Obama being elected president of the United States in 2008. A lot of people were upset about that. And a lot of people did not want a Black person to be leading the country. So I think those two things kind of combined together, you get this big retaliation in 2016, and it's framed as the enemy abroad. And the President Trump kind of goes through the term really focusing on policy and EOs that are disruptive to immigration and our travel bans and border walls and things like that. All these things that are talking about keeping people out. And then we have the COVID crisis, and America elects Joe Biden. Joe Biden becomes president and tries to, also the Democrats took House of Representatives and tried to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, which would have restored pre-clearance to southern states, but also it afforded additional protections. I believe there was a provision about gerrymandering in that bill as well. But that bill unfortunately fails. And then we have the 2024 election. And also in this time period, we have more shots fired from the Supreme Court. We have the decision comes down. We have the SFFA decision comes down, which basically says that it's against the law to have programs that use race to consider admissions in ways that they frame are rewarding or punitive to white students and rewarding to Black students or people who are historically discriminated against. And so we're dealing with all those things. And now we have the election of the first Black woman to be vice president, Kamala Harris, at the same time. And we also have the first Black woman put on the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. And then we kind of have test two, which, we already failed test one. So then we failed test two again as well. But this time it was different. And I think the framing of the president's campaign on the second time was like the enemy within, and he's able to really set up this fear campaign and these tactics that really harbor on hate, but also create this idea that Black American programs and Black American equal rights pose a threat to everyone else. And I think that belief and that hatred sold really well in 2024 because people are also just upset about the state of the economy in the world as well, that those things combined really presented an opportunity for the president to capitalize on it and to use that framework to kind of usher in this new era, this new Jim Crow, this new Nadir that represses and does not enforce anything that is related to civil rights or the protection of black rights and Black voting rights in particular. And then you have the coordinated efforts lining up as well. So you already had the Supreme Court making actions from even the Biden administration. They were taking major losses. And really the 6-3 conservative majority was really like setting up the framework to destabilize laws that protect Black people in places in southern states, right? And then you have state legislatures already jumping into action and really kind of writing and creating laws that disenfranchise people in a way that they know the Supreme Court won't overturn. So those are the first two pieces prongs together. Then you have the Republican Party takes back control of the House of Representatives and the Senate and the White House. So now you have no requirement to enforce the law, but you also have an executive branch that is willing to go out of its way to prosecute or enforce laws in a way that turns jurisprudence and case law and precedent on its head, to use case law that's traditionally been used to protect Black folks to prosecute alleged discrimination against white people. And then you also have a legislative branch that is not going to pass any legislation that promotes or even looks like it promotes further expansion of voting rights or the protections afforded to American people across the country. And like I said, it's just all a coordinated effort between the three branches of government and the allies at the state and local level to use SCOTUS as a validation power to prevent the federal government from intervening on civil rights violations by lesser governments, while having Congress control measures and prevent the passage of anything that's going to be protective or more expansive than what we already have. And the long and short of it is that this ain't your grandmama's Supreme Court and this ain't your grandmama's government. They're not interested in expanding or protecting our rights in any way. And now we have to look for creative opportunities to fight back. The beautiful thing about the past is that it's there for us to learn from, right? And if this is the second coming of the Nadir, we have the history of the first. And it's our responsibility to make sure that this time around, it doesn't operate in the same way that the first one did, where it took a very long time to get where we are, but also the progress was able to be erased with the stroke of a pen by the Supreme Court. As much as we're paying attention to our history, I think our enemies are watching our history as well and finding ways to create laws and or things that will not be able to be easily overturned or easily corrected in one or two changes in Congress. So now we have to think about, how do we create a system in America where 50 years from now, our children who are civil rights lawyers aren't fighting the same fights that we are. But nevertheless, those are my thoughts and my kind of brief summary of, and it's not all inclusive, but of the American Nadirs rather, and the coming of the second. Take care of yourself, be well, and I'll see y'all later. Love and light. Peace.